does not end, nor does it endure forever. It does not arrive or lead. It has no location, neither inside nor outside nor in the middle. Unborn, undying, its essence and appearance is just so as it really is. It is permanent and unchanging. It is called the way. So this is the first passage, and let's read the second one, then we'll go into it. Shui Jian then asked, how is your explanation of unborn and undying different from the outside the way teachings? The master answered, the unborn and undying of which the outside way speak depicts nothingness as the end of life, and life as a clear contrast to nothingness. Their nothingness is really not nothing, and the life of which they speak is not really life. It is the unborn and undying I speak of originally. There is no birth then, nor is there any death now. Therefore, I teach something very different from them. If you wish to understand the essentials of the mind, simply do not deliberate over good and evil, or good and bad, and you will spontaneously access the pure essence of the mind, which is always still, like deep, clear water, yet with subtle functions as numerous as the sand grains in the Ganges. Okay, as I said, this is very terse and seemingly inaccessible. And what I want to go through a little bit is some of the language being used here. This is an extension of a conversation about what's considered the highest state of a person's ability, called nirvana. It is listed as the third of the Four Noble Truths. It's listed in all the text as being the ultimate goal, ultimate meaning, the ultimate perfection of our abilities. Sometimes called Anyudra, Samyaksam Bodhi, called Nirvana, sometimes called Bodhi Nirvana. It's meshed with awakening Nirvana. And it's also then presented as the Tosa, which is this idea of ending birth and death. So these are very hard terms for even Buddhists who've been studying for a long time to grasp, and I'm not going to claim that I understand them, and maybe I can get at what they're not. So how can the highest goal, being this called nirvana, also be the ending of birth and death, which would seem to be then the highest goal is some annihilation of existence or whatever. And yet we get a sense here, just I want to say affectively, we get a sense here, not of that. This does not end on a depressing nihilistic note. I mean, you look at the language, it's still and deep like clear water, yet functions as numerous as the grains of sands in the Ganges. It is permanent and unchanging, it's called the way. There seems to be something here that's describing, rather than a birth and then a death and then nothingness, something about a continuity, and a continuity that is not how we ordinarily think of things. We usually think of birth as a beginning and death as an end. And I think what the text is proposing tonight, that these are artificial projections or reifications or essentializations that we put on top of phenomena that don't fit these very well. Death is not the end, and birth is not the beginning. These are markers along a continuity. And so what's being described here is not necessarily the ending of birth and death as we think of it in a physical way, that there was no more there's no more birth, and death is the end, and it's all over. I think what's rather being described here is the problem of birth and death. The problem of an involuntary samsaric coming and going repeatedly, and out of our control, so to speak, is resolved. Now, that's different than saying existence ends. It's saying the way that we perceive it, the way that we have framed it, and thus created a problem of, oh my gosh, I'm only born to die, and so forth, and the anxiety associated around this, is a self-constructed riddle that we've made by reifying these ideas into something concrete that they're not. And as a result, the ending of birth and death is ending of the problem of birth and death, ending of the confusion surrounding that. But it's not, it couldn't be, if you really think about it. If you think about everything we've read so far, it could not be positing that the highest goal we got to change is to be completely released from all life, existence, consciousness whatsoever. I mean, indeed, if that was the highest goal, then there'd be no reason to have these texts, there'd be no reason to do self-cultivation, there'd be no reason to practice, to contemplate, to ponder, to make vows, and so forth. It'd all be like, it's over, the lights are out, that's it. Why did you waste your time crossing your legs, reading text, and so forth? So I think what's being posited here is not that. Okay, it's not that. I caught myself. Okay. So let's go. Ordinary people see things essentially non-dual. So here's the first concept we have, this duality, non-duality. Now, this kind of thinking, dualistic thinking, is associated with a concept that's used, associated with something called essentializing. And essentializing has to do with a kind of, essentializing thinking is anchored in dualistic thinking. And so what you do is you take categories and present them as opposites, this and that. In this text, or human and animal, or life and death. And you make those essentially distinct, separate categories unto themselves. And sometimes this is used to also, in the Buddhist sense, to say, oh, living beings and Buddha. These, they're essentialized as two distinct categories. And yet you see here this very important line. He says, this nature is non-dual. It's not diminished in ordinary beings, nor is it greater and worthy in sages. So he's breaking down the duality right there. He's saying it's not the fact that Buddhists have this enlightened nature and living beings don't. He's saying it's the same nature in ordinary people and in worthy sages. So the distinction here is a false distinction. He's talking about something that doesn't, in fact, have this duality to it. Sometimes the duality is posed in terms of worldly and world transcending. And again, throughout all these texts and these teachings, these dichotomies, this essentializing is challenged and broken down. So that's the first one. I think last week you went into the afflictions are bodhi, that passage. It's basically talking about, that's an essentialism, okay? Afflictions, confusion, dukkha, and bodhi, enlightened, nirvana. And these are two different things. And I want to get nirvana and bodhi, and da-da-da. And what's being presented here is that they are a single substance in different forms. And we use the example like ice and water. Ice is still water. Water can be ice, but it's one substance in two forms. So afflictions and bodhi are not two distinct, essentialized different things, but different functionings almost. And that's where I'm getting at this. It's not, we have to be careful not to philosophize this, because really it's talking about a psychological projection thing that's going on. So when we're locked within, let's say we're locked within a paradigm, and I've used this expression before, you all know paradigm paralysis, right? You're locked within a paradigm. Now the paradigm in this text is twofold, or in many texts it says we're locked in the paradigm of what's called the skandhas and the 18 realms. So how our sensory organs work with the senses and the consciousness that we form around that, and then the 5 skandhas that when we're confused and therefore imprisoned in those, we only see things through that, and we only can see within that frame of reference. So but our basic nature is said to be pure and bodhi. So what's happening here is that when we have a turning of thought, emotion, attachment, grasping, and setting up in any of these, and the text literally say we become imprisoned in this paradigm of the skandhas and the places. Once that happens, our bodhi becomes afflictions, it becomes confusion. So the water becomes ice, so to speak. At the same time, right within those realms and skandhas and places, we're not confused, we're not attached, we're not grasping or seeking, bodhi, afflictions become bodhi, and ice becomes water. The substance hasn't changed, just the functioning or the form of it, in a sense, has changed, but not the substance. So that's what's meant by non-dual. So this is, if you think about it, it's and here lower he uses a word of static. This is dynamic as opposed to static. And this is, rather than a state you attain, a functioning you maintain, if I can use that language. In other words, it's dynamic, it's active, it's never stopping. And that's what part of his reasoning here is: not born, it's not dying, whatnot. He's talking about a state of operative, balanced equanimity that doesn't set up anywhere. Because it doesn't set up anywhere, all these markers of a beginning and an end don't apply. They only apply when they try to stop that. And the interesting thing is, he's saying you cannot stop that, because the nature of everything is to constantly flow and move and turn. Therefore, you're trying to stop it in the midst of that, put you in opposition to things as they really are. And that's why he says, unborn, undying, it's just so as it really is. It's called the way. Just so as it really is. So you have now aligned your consciousness and your behavior, your day-to-day activities, your life-to-life understanding with the way things really are. And in that's what he calls it, the way. He uses the word Tao. It's the Tao. That's what it means to be a person of the way with no mind. Because the mind is not activating and projecting and reifying and essentializing. Now that, you're thinking, well, what? But that's what our mind does all the time. So this is the trick, is the mind, and let me put it in more concrete terms what's being talked about here. It is the mind that seeks and grasps and wants. It's the grasping, seeking, wanting mind that reifies this. It's this and that, mine and not yours, life and death. And we take that for real. That mind becomes so strong and so powerful, we actually think that that's how it really is. And you're like, no, it is like that. No, I'm saying the text, that's how we think it really is. And this mind, this habitual forming mind is so powerful and so strong in this way that even when we try to think our way out of it, we can't, because our very thinking modes and structures and logical mechanisms are set up to reinforce it. So it's really a self-referential loop of ignorance. But we think this is the way it really is. So this is the paradox he's trying to play with here. He's trying to point out not so much that there is a nirvana and a bodhi apart from something else that you will get, but the whole way you're framing and coming at this is the problem. This is what he's presented to the Chamberlain as the teaching. So this becomes really important because, for example, the Shurangama Sutra describes it this way. This mental functioning, this habitual confused functioning that we take to be our normal consciousness, seeking, grasping, wanting, fearing losing, wanting to get, worried, anxious, jealous, so forth, all the associated afflictions with that state of mind, the busy mind, the mad busy mind, the Shurangama very clearly says when that mind actually stops, quiets, lets go, stops putting fuel on the fire, hence nirvana, no fuel in the fire. When that mind stops, that very stopping is bodhi. It's not like when that mind stops, then you get bodhi. It's when that very mind stops that is bodhi. So the mad mind stopping, the original ground returns bodhi, ice returns back to water, there's nothing to get. But the converse is equally true. When that mad mind stirs, bodhi becomes afflictions. So now you're dealing with a dynamic functioning thing. Rather than an attainment, there's this constant. What's proposed in this text is very interesting too, is that at the beginning, well, I don't know, where's the beginning? So here I go with these words again. Right now is the beginning, the middle, and the end, okay? There is nothing but the present, and the present doesn't really exist except as a continuation of, anyhow. Right at this very moment, we are doing this. At this very moment when we stop doing this, afflictions turn into bodhi, and samsara turns into nirvana. At the very moment, if we don't do that, it goes the opposite way. And it's not like it's far away to get, or it's an after-death experience or anything like that. It's only in the here and now. And what this text is offering, and I'm going to push out a little bit, the ending of birth and death means your attachment to those ideas as beginning and ends. The ending of birth and death is to be ever in the here and now. There is nothing else but the continuous here and now. And at what we think is death is just another here and now in a changed state. And before birth was just another here and now. So the here and now is all you have to deal with. And the text is interesting, that's all you can deal with. And that's all you need to deal with. So that's why he says, if in one thought, one emotion, one feeling, one urge, you're not confused, you don't follow, you don't grasp and attach, in that one moment of not doing that, you are a Buddha. You say, wow, I'm going to retire. And in that one thought, you're a living being. Wow! So that's why it says in that one thought, you're Buddha. But if you can do that in thought after thought, you're Buddha. You see the continuity, the dynamic functioning. It's not like you've attained Buddhahood and that's it. You have to keep working. Now it's said to get easier, so the habitual tendency towards ignorance and grasping lightens and lessens. And it doesn't lighten and lessen just because you're working hard. It lightens and lessens because you feel the joy and liberation that comes from letting go. It becomes self-reinforcing. But the text also says, if in one thought you're confused, and you grasp and attach in that one thought, you're a confused living being. And if you do that thought after thought, you remain a confused living being. But you see, again, it's dynamic and fluid and a functioning rather than a setting in stone or something. So I think, to get into this is really important to understand because, and I'm going to argue tonight that this is, although I use the language reify, and reify literally from the Latin, rea means from raise, from things, and fi means to make or to endow or bestow into a thing. To reify makes something immaterial material. It's like the word deify. Deify means to make something into a god. Okay, so reify means to take something that is immaterial, insubstantial, flowing in flux, and to make it seemingly real, like time, or like me. Oh. So we reify a me. But where in this me is there something that's permanent, unchanging, stable, and not subject to change? Oh yeah, later, I'll think about that later. No. Right now there's me. But even as you're doing that, the me is constantly shifting and changing. I went back to the Heraclitus quote. Heraclitus got it right. You can't stick your foot in the same river twice, and it's not the same foot that goes into the river, and so on and so forth. And even to say something is to say what? Is just a continuation of, where is it? Where does it is? It is not. So even Heraclitus, a Greek who is not a Buddhist as far as I know, got this. And I would argue that even if you look at modern science closely enough, you'll see that there's a similar position offered, that unchanging stable is nowhere to be found. Now, if I'm the scientist, I say, yes, that's the nature of reality. But I don't hold the mirror up and say, well, does that apply to me as well? There's no stable unchanging to be found. So this is important to get at because if there's just a continuous here and now, then it changes the ground psychologically of what we're doing. And it makes us mindful. But this mindfulness is to pay attention to the here and now. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I fantasizing, entertaining? Because what I am doing then becomes, it hardens into who I get stuck as. And the untying of that loosens who I get unstuck as. And that loosening of the unsticking is called Buddha. And the sticking and getting stuck is the living being. So I'm presenting this as, although I use the term reify and essentialize, this is not primarily a philosophical discussion. I want to say this again. This is not about philosophy. Although it is philosophical in some ways, it's primarily psychological. And that, what's driving this is not a reified or essentialized conceptualization. It's an anxiety deep in the marrows of the fear of not being, the fear of mortality. And so the grasping, the seeking is coming not from a philosophical point of view, because philosophically, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, even Heidegger, I should say, even Heidegger, especially Heidegger, even Heidegger realizes this. So, it's psychological, and as psychological, it's not necessarily rational. That doesn't mean it's not powerful. It's more powerful than rational. We live our lives 90+% not on rationality, and not just because of the current situation of the world. It's been this way since ever. We live it on psychological urgings, unexamined impulses, anxieties, deep set. So this one particularly, the urge to seek and grasp, is coming from this fear of not being, this fear of more. And what the Buddha is saying here is this is the paradigm paralysis, and you're never going to get beyond that fear by trying to give it something concrete to hold on to. It won't work. It can't work. First of all, there's nothing concrete to hold on to get. But that fear will never be satisfied except through liberation, not by replacing it with anything. So where does the liberation come? This is the paradox. Let go, release your hold. In other words, the grasping, seeking is the anxiety-driven activity of living beings. It's what we do 24/7, even when we're asleep. And what the text is saying, that pattern is driven by this unexamined fear. The only way to get outside of this is to let go, to stop the seeking, to stop the grasping. This is what cultivation is all about. It's psychological. So even when you're doing meditation, you're just doing warm-up exercises in a sense of getting a feel of what it's like to be quiet for a while. Tune the sense organs down a little bit so they're not so actively grasping and seeking, and see if in quieting something starts to open up that wasn't there before. That's why when I say that the nirvana, and here this idea of ending birth and death, is not the ending of existence, but it's the ending of the problem of existence as we've constructed it within the paradigm paralysis. Otherwise you wouldn't have the statement, this is pure power. True emptiness, in other words, it says be wonderful existence. Well, wait a minute. Now what they mean by true emptiness means let go, seeking nothing, wanting nothing. Okay? So what emptiness means here is the absence of any movement based on insecurity, inadequacy, craving, and desire. You recognize that these are false urges and longings. You do not have to follow them. And by putting them to rest, by stopping that process, that's called emptiness. Now, you could say, so true emptiness is, that's it. That's not what it says. It says it's wonderful existence. So what I'm posing here is that the ending of birth and death, true emptiness being wondrous existence, has to suggest to us that the paradigm shift occurs by getting outside of the habitual framing, and that can only be done through practice, through direct experience. It can't be done intellectually, because our intellectual, we can get a pointing here of what's being pointed at, but this alone will not deliver that. So that's, to me, we spent a lot of time trying to unpack this, but I think getting at the essence of this is more important. For those of you who want to explore this a little more on your own, page 79, I just went back, he talks about this again in this language. And it's in the middle of page 79 towards the end. The Buddha pointed out the true bliss of nirvana. Now wait a minute. If there's a true bliss of nirvana, it can't be nothingness, right? And he says, and this is another enigmatic passage of pointing, if even for an instance there is no sign of arising and no sign of passing, no seeking and no losing, then there is no birth and death to be ended, and right there is to enjoy still cessation. To enjoy still cessation. You see? But it's really what he's saying, if there is no arising or passing, getting and losing, wanting and fearing loss, when that mad mind stops, Bodhi, you have the same thing here. But when it is right there, if one has no thought of it being right there, this is permanence and bliss. Because you can't even say, oh, now it's there, I got it. because he then stopped. So that's just one passage. The other one I was looking at was on page 91, which we read earlier at the bottom. And here's another description of it. I just want to point out throughout the text, there's descriptions. All of these are alluding to the same thing we're talking about tonight. Mind ground free, empty. Mind ground. My mind ground empty of air, essential nature's morality. It holds itself. Mind ground free of delusion, confusion. That's essential nature's wisdom. In other words, he's saying the freedom from, the absence of, is morality, it's wisdom. And the mind ground undisturbed, activated, distracted, nervous, fetching, that's concentration. It's all described in terms of freedom from this rather than getting some. It never increases or decreases. Now we're back to the same theme. Indestructible as Vajra. And here's the great line. Body comes and goes, yet you're rooted in samadhi. Whoa. So what we think of as birth and death, which is associated, I said, with the skandhas and the realms, the body coming and going, is not. That's the construct we put on it when we attach to this narrow paradigm of the material and separating from the immaterial. And again, in this non-dual, material and material are not dual either. So body comes and goes, yet rooted in samadhi. This suggests, and I'm not going to try to explain this because I don't, even the Buddha doesn't try to explain it. Who should I? Well, I'll try to explain what the Buddha did. No, I just say, take away effectively the feel of what's being described here. One, there is something that is blissful, that's really far out wondrous, and it's reached or realized in a letting go and emptying of everything we think is real and significant and lasting. So it's both a presentation of positivity and also a paradox of how one would realize it by absolutely letting go and stopping seeking in any form. This is what's being put forward to us. I don't know if that helps a little bit, because I think sometimes we can come at this too philosophically and just go away. Literally pulling your hair out, not to leave home, but just pulling your hair out and scratching your head and saying, this doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense. Because the sense-making apparatus is part of that habitual, confused mind. That sixth consciousness is functioning, the intellectual, cognitive consciousness called the sixth consciousness is set up to construct everything through this language, through these patterns, and then to try to solve the puzzles this way. And what the Buddha is saying here is that the puzzle can be solved, but it can't be solved by the way you're playing on this game board. You get off the game board to answer this. And the game board is your own creation. So you're actually locking yourself into your own logical... I think in engineering there must be a concept like this. I use self-referential, but it's like a loop, right? It's just a perpetual motion within some pattern of looping that never has an exit. I don't know if it's what Sartre means by no exit, but it has to do with this sense of we get locked in this. And so he's taking, I think, the Chamberlain here, he's not playing with the Chamberlain, he's not putting him down. He's taking the Chamberlain to the ultimate point of saying, you have asked for the teaching, and I'm going to give you what the teaching is, and you're going to take this back, and they're going to be scratching their heads too. But hopefully, in what I've said here, you'll see there's a solution, there's a key here. This isn't just a negative, pessimistic portrayal of ending birth and death, but a suggestion that there's something far beyond this, and that there's a way to get there. So let's go on. Hearing this explanation, Shui Jian sunk into a deep depression and took an overdose. No. Okay, I didn't want to. Experienced an immediate and expansive awakening. Now, I don't know, did you, when you heard this? And so obviously something clicked for him. He bowed, he took his leave, returned to the palace where he reported the master's words.
It was executed.
How's that?
It was immediately executed.
And was probably immediately executed. Or maybe we should send somebody else. But I want to point out too here, this is not the best translation, but if you wish to understand, this is on page 101. I want to get this passage to reinforce my last point, because I ramble. If you wish to understand the essentials of the mind, how this mind works, how it sets up, and how it lets go, do not deliberate over good and bad. Do not use consciousness. Use something that is before thought, and you will spontaneously access. Now, the word spontaneously means immediately, not mediated through anything else. In other words, it will be just us. That you see, this occurs earlier. When remember, somebody asked him. I think it was when he went for his first talk. He said, "Well, what did you get? What was transmitted? Nothing." We just talked about jian, seeing. This is another translation of that. You will see it immediately, as it is, and that's what the passage says, as it truly is. So this is what awakening is. It isn't getting anything. It is letting go of all impediments, letting go of all projections, so that you see things as they are immediately, because that is your nature to see that. And not seeing them immediately and setting up all this stuff is the nature twisted, constricted, covered over, shrunken, consciousness collapsing, and so on and so forth, until we're down into this little well. And so I think the thing to take away from this, both of all, it's psychological and it's behavioral. He is suggesting that the transcendence, if you will, is a behavioral shift. It's not a mystical lifting up, transportation, nor is some divine thing entering you like light or whatever coming in, like you see in the movies, and the eyes glow and all the rays come out. It's rather something you become. It's something you turn into. You transform yourself into this. It's not something you get, but rather something you change into by letting go. Or even you might say it happens by itself when you let go. It's not even you have to activate the change, because it's the natural tendency to go towards this purity and stillness, but we obstruct it. So, that being said, I wanted to share one last thing with you tonight, because I've been trying to think about this for a long time. This particular stance about what nirvana is, for those of you interested, you'll see it in the Lotus Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, the Vajra Sutra, the Vimuktihari Sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra is probably the best expression of this. That in fact what happens is when a Buddha or Bodhisattva attains nirvana and the enlightenment of nirvana, it is not an entry into extinction. It is not an entry into extinction. It is something else. Basically, it's a state of non-attachment. It's not an entry into extinction. It's a state of non-attachment that allows them to remain active in the world on behalf of living beings, and yet not be in the paradigm paralysis of that conditioned world. And that's why you have this wonderful expression that I like. It says, through great wisdom, there is no abiding in birth and death. Abiding, setting up in that pattern. But also through great compassion, there's no dwelling in nirvana as a total remove from. So now you have a dynamic thing again. Because of wisdom, there's no hanging on to conditioned reality. And because of compassion, there's no leaving the world for some solitary extinction. But there is compassion and wisdom working simultaneously. You're in the world but not of the world. And then birth, and this is really interesting. So, we only got a few minutes, let me finish. I've been trying to work on this, and it's really hard. And I made the mistake of trying to put something into writing. And I don't know if that I'll... Because somebody asked me, could I do this? And I naively said, sure. But let me read you, this is the last page of an essay I'm trying to work on. Normally I don't read you, I want to show you where I've come to in wrestling with this. This is the last few paragraphs. The Buddha certainly must have sensed, indeed saw around him, how easily the teaching of no self could be misconstrued as nothingness. Because at the heart of the confusion is the reification of a self on those skandhas and places. That's the problem. But it doesn't mean there isn't any me. It just means that self as a total, impermanent, unchanging entity that goes on as is not real. So it could be misconstrued as nothingness and lead to despair and hopelessness. He explicitly countered such misunderstanding by proclaiming, there is an unborn, an unarising, an uncreating, an unconditioning. If there were no unborn, there would be no release from what is born, rise, and created. So he is giving an optimistic note here. The Buddha steered a delicately nuanced middle course. He neither espoused nihilism nor encouraged any speculation on a paradise existing outside of space and time that an immortal self could look forward to and eternally enjoy. He simply stated that there's suffering that has a cause that can be ended, and there's a path that leads to the ending of it. But the nature and content of nirvana and of the Buddha state, he refused to describe. Now, why did he do that? Because he wanted a bunch of followers to keep hanging on with this idea that they'd get an answer to something. No. He refused to describe or discuss what the content and the nature of that nirvana was. Why?
I was going to ask you, Marty, earlier, and it seems related now to me to what you're saying now. And that is that, the little glimpses that I've got of that state is immediately betrayed, if you will, by the mind coming in and saying,
That's
I
a
got it.
wonderful use of language, betrayed.
Yeah, it is a betrayal.
Yes, it is.
The mind comes in and says, I got it.
Et tu, Brute.
Yeah, and that means that it's over. Yeah.
Well, what it means is you've got the attention of the mind. You've got its attention.
Right.
It says, oh, he's going someplace without me. Come back, right? And you then have a choice, and it says and the habit is so strong at that point. You're my little child, you're my baby. I've cultivated your mind and your intellect. We're really strong, and the will that comes out of you forever and ever. And then you start dying, and it goes, oh, goodbye. No, you're gonna stay. No, it goes. So you can't hold it, and it can't hold you. But while we're in this relationship, we think it's a marriage that's going to last forever. So it's really funny. And it's like at that point, I say you have to have faith. And what I mean by faith is confidence in the method to know that if you can feel the betrayal, that's already a kind of awakening. Most of us never feel the betrayal. We feel, I'm back in my paradigm. I'm ever so comfortable. Until the earth quakes or the hair falls out or you get a cavity or whatever it is. And it starts to quake again, and where's mind at that point? Oh, you got a problem, buddy. Thank you. So that is what I call the bittersweet dynamic tension of cultivation. The mind that seeks to attach, to become clear, to become free, fights with the mind of desire and craving and grasping. And my teacher had a wonderful verse. He says, truth, the truth of nirvana, Brody, fights with the passions. And then his last line is, practice decides. So you come back. You're not going to solve it intellectually. And if you do, the betrayal thing is there. But practice gets you beyond that thing. So it's a wonderful, great. Let me finish almost done here. He did not discuss regret except in the most vague and metaphorical language. Languagely, he open dismissed as borrowed, inadequate, and ultimately false. Whatever state lies beyond the end of suffering, and also necessarily beyond the reach of the self and all the self could imagine, no amount of thinking or study could reveal it. But by its very nature, more precisely because of our lack of enlightenment, it must remain inaccessible to thoughts, language, feelings, imaginations, and longings of the self and what belongs to the self. Why? Because we are like prisoners in Plato's allegory of the cave, who mistake the shadows of the wall for reality. We ordinary living beings, according to the Buddha, and I'm quoting a passage here, are, and here's the passage, lost in a dense forest of ignorance, blocked and obstructed, imprisoned in a narrow cave dwelling of the skandhas, chained by the fetters of our own cravings and fears, so swallowed up in the view of self that we spin and flow in the whirlpool of birth and death, so confused and dazed by the self that like blind men without guides constantly mistake dead ends for exits. Whoa, this is really a beautiful passage. So let me finish here. The Buddha's nirvana, however, can be known directly only with the awakening to the truth of no self. And so the Avatamsaka Sutra describes it as a state beyond all duality, without beginning, middle, or end, and cannot be expressed in words, and is even beyond time. And here's the passage I love from the Avatamsaka. These are the quotes. The Buddha's state, our state of perfect awakened wisdom, is born of wisdom. It's difficult to express. It's difficult to accept. It is not thought, and leaves the path of the mind. The skandhas, the realms and places, are not its gateway, and the wise know that intellect cannot reach it. Like traces of a bird in an empty sky, so difficult to express, so hard to discern. I love that. The traces of a bird. What trace does a bird leave as it's flying? Incomprehensible to mind and thought, but from compassion, kindness, and the power of vows, these states appear and one can enter them. So, they're incomprehensible to mind and ordinary thought, but compassion and kindness and vows, you can enter into this. Gradually, there is perfection of the mind. Wisdom's practices are not reflection's realm. Wisdom's practices are not the thinking realm. And here's the last passage of that. Such states as these are difficult to perceive. They can only be known, not expressed. Only through a Buddha power are they proclaimed. Receive them with all respect. This is how it ends. But I love that last line. They can be known. They can be experienced, but not explained or expressed. So this is pointing to the point I was trying to make here of being psychological, that it is practice, persistent practice, on a proper method that actually breaks through the paradigm. Not reflection, not thought, not thinking. And so we're coming back to then the heart of this has to do with the doing and doing it consistently, regularly, and right, and it delivers. So I was saying here, I think for the, I should finish. Hang on. No, please bear with me. I'll do this fast. That year, on the third day of the 9th month, the imperial proclamation was issued extolling the master, even though he refused to come. I think after they heard what he had to say, they were glad he didn't come. Because you want to go back to the throne after you heard that? Due to old age and sickness, the master declined our invitation. I mean, that's like a great way to start it. Like, he wanted to come, he really wanted to come, but he couldn't because he was sick. He loves us. Cultivating the way for us. Now, come on, what do really, if you think about it, everything he says, you got to do it yourself, no one saves you but yourself, cultivating the way for us. Oh my God. You are a field of blessings for the country. Oh, jeez. There's no field of blessings for cultivating your own field, okay? But just like Vimalakirti, who uses his illness to expound the Mahayana in Vaishali. That passage you probably don't know. I brought it tonight, but under the illusion that I would share it with you, but I'm not. Because it's just this beautiful chapter in the Vimalakirti Sutra when the Buddha sends, I think, Shariputra to visit Vimalakirti when he's sick, and Vimalakirti gives a Buddhist thing on sickness. Whoa, it's really great. Anyhow, they were showing off that they knew that passage. Just like Vimalakirti, he was sick and couldn't come, so he had to send Shariputra. You pass along the mind of the Buddhas and expound the non-dual Dharma. They say that, but did they, okay. Shwejen told us that, so that's what we got. Shwejen has conveyed the Master's teaching of the knowledge and vision of the Tathagata. Because of the accumulated good deeds, the roots of goodness planted in previous lives, we are fortunate to be born at a time when the Masters in the world and to directly awaken to the Supreme Vehicle. We bow our heads in unending gratitude for your kindness. Okay, there it is. I don't have to say much about this. I think you all have enough sophistication to read between the lines here. By the way, this kind of verbiage hasn't changed. The Master is also presented with a fine formal roll and a crystal bowl as gifts. Come on, guys, what the hell use does this enlightened master have with a fine robe and a crystal bowl? And the governor of Shao province is commanded to restore and refurbish the monastery buildings, and that he can use. The master's former residence is converted into a temple called Nation's Gratitude, Guan Su. And there we end chapter 9. So that'll take us, and I did. I promised I'd finish one chapter tonight, and although we didn't do last chapter, we'll start up again in September. So normally we go a little longer in May, but for the reasons I mentioned at the outset, we're not going to go longer than tonight. But at the same time, I give my exhortation to you. Don't let a single day go by that you don't practice. Don't let a single day go by that you don't find something wrong with your health. Don't let a single day go by that you don't find something to be happy and joyous about. And get closer to nature in the next months coming up and unplug a little bit. I am going to go to Maine, I hope, again, all things being equal, and get lost in the wilderness. What is it? It was John Muir. I think it was John Muir. I think it was John Muir who said, "In wildness is the hope of humankind." And he wasn't talking about the Discovery Channel. So somehow, by being close to nature, we can kind of find ourselves again. So I hope you take the time to do those things in the summer. Any closing questions, comments? Nothing?
Marty, the full character Liao Sheng Tuosi, you mentioned.
Liao Sheng Tuosi.
Right. Because Jason is here right now. We have the exchange email many years ago about this term. The Liao Sheng Tuosi, the Liao first character, not only mean to end, but also mean to understand. So hopefully this can provide another dimension to look at this full character.
This is, everybody hear what she said? The four character phrase, and you see that every night here, before, not this lecture, but before the Dharma lecture, somebody circumambulates 3 times, stick of incense bows, will the Dharma master out of compassion to the assembly and all living beings, turn the wonderful Dharma wheel, cause all living beings to leave suffering and attain bliss, and then Liao Sheng Tuosi to end birth and death. And it's said every night before a lecture, but your point is the Liao, Sheng and Si is birth and death or living and dying, but the Liao has been translated as ending, but it can mean to understand. It also can mean to resolve, to figure out. And so if you say they figured out or they resolved or they understood the nature of this and therefore attained this liberation, it's a whole different spin on it. That's why translation has to be, but again, I would say without practice and cultivation, translation doesn't advance to that point. It gets stuck at the dictionary. So to get past the dictionary, you have to go into the mind ground and actually experience a transformation where once you experience that transformation, you say, that's not the right word. That's not the right word. Because words do matter. Ending birth and death, for a lot of people, just sounds like a kind of nihilistic extinction. Or as Carl Jung, when he first encountered, he said it was a radical denial of existence because of that translation. Nirvana was extinction and ending birth and death. So extinction and ending apply, that. And if he had resolving, which he got later and got excited about Buddhism, but his first encounter was with those stilted dictionary translations. But at the same time, without people who were actively cultivating the time, that's the best they could do. I mean, their linguistic skills in Sanskrit and Pali were far beyond mine. But still, while that was an effective tool, it was also a limited tool of getting at the spirit. And also maybe even the meaning. So anyhow, thank you. Okay, that being that, we'll do the transference and send you off for a while. I know you had a question, Connie, and I didn't ignore you. You can ask after.
Okay.
You all have questions that you don't ask, but that's okay. I appreciate that, thank you.